Hello, and welcome to Law and Democracy, a podcast of the election law program at The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law. I'm Tony Gaughan, and I'm joined by Terri, Enns, Ned Foley, and Steve Huefner. And today, we have a very special program on the lessons that election law can learn from the World Cup, the biggest soccer tournament in the world. As our audience undoubtedly knows, soccer is the most popular sport in the world, and discussing the World Cup is particularly timely today because we are now 2 weeks into the World Cup, and the United States is hosting it, along with our neighbors Mexico and Canada, for the first time since 1994. The scale of the World Cup has no parallel in global sports. It blows away even the Super Bowl of American football. The Super Bowl averages about 120 million viewers each year. In contrast, the World Cup attracts billions of viewers. And this year's World Cup is already setting all-time records for viewership. The nation that wins the World Cup is crowned the global champion of soccer. The stakes, therefore, are extremely high. There are 48 teams that enter the tournament in pursuit of the title. FIFA, the international federation that governs the sport, has established a complex system for determining which of the 48 teams that compete in the first round will advance to the round of 32, which is known as the knockout round because it becomes a single elimination tournament at that point. The challenge, of course, is many teams end up tied in total points at the end of the first round, so FIFA has to decide how to resolve those tiebreakers. And they have to do it in a way that is viewed as fair by the whole world, which is no easy task. But we want to begin just by discussing our impressions of the World Cup, which we've all been following over the last couple of weeks. So my first question is, what are you excited about, Terri, Ned, and Steve, after getting 2 weeks to be part, at least through television, of this amazing experience?
Well, I was a convert to what the world calls football as an adult. I didn't have much appreciation for it really until my children started to play it, but I sure now enjoy watching it and do think it's a remarkable demonstration of both individual performance and teamwork. And it's fun to see players who compete in other times of the year for professional teams where their nationality is not relevant and they're assembled regardless of nation, and now they're competing for their nation. So sometimes they're competing against teammates with whom they play on professional league teams, and both camaraderie and excitement that they themselves show just adds to the enjoyment I feel in watching it.
Well, one thing I found this time around, I paid more attention to it this time than in previous years. And what I like about it in comparison to the Olympics, let's say, is it's just one sport. And so you can really follow the development of the tournament from the very first set of matches, all the way through in a way that the Olympics is just too much to follow. You can only get tiny snippets. So it's easy to get fully immersed into the excitement of the tournament.
And the Olympics is also more individually focused. I mean, I know there are, team scoring and team parts of it, but I do like watching, I like watching plays develop. I like watching teams they're the fast teams, they're the slow teams. There's just so much variety. And I feel like for the most part, the announcers have been doing a good job of keeping us informed. I did find, they fawn over a few folks, that is for sure. And it's kind of fun because they're almost childlike. Like they're so excited about watching these players do their thing and do it well. So yeah, I've been having fun watching.
Yeah, certainly me too, Terri. I've been struck by how much fun both the I think our country has had in hosting fans from all over the world, and also how much fun those fans are having here. It's, during a really challenging time both for our country and for the world. For me, this has been a really welcome moment of unity, both within our country, but also, I think, around the world, to be reminded that we're all on the same planet together and there are things we have in common, like this love of this sport, including for those of us. I'm like all of you. I am somebody who appreciates soccer, but it certainly was not a sport that would be a sport I was super knowledgeable about before the World Cup. But now I feel the excitement and energy, like the Scots in Boston and the fans of all the teams around the country.
And to be a little parochial about things, the U.S. team has obviously gotten off to a very good start. And I was hearing one commentator just talking about the possible audience within the U.S. alone in the knockout rounds if the U.S. continues to perform. That you compared earlier, Tony, the total global audience of World Cup to the Super Bowl of American football. But I was hearing that even the U.S. audience for some of the later stages of the knockout World Cup this year could be huge if the U.S. is continuing to advance.
Absolutely, Steve. In fact, I last saw it, the first couple rounds have been at almost World Series or NBA Finals levels. So certainly interest will continue to build.
Mhm. And one of the, again, there's someone who, like you, came to soccer as an adult, and I didn't play it as a kid. Uh, there's this, even though obviously talent is hugely important, and there are better teams and less strong teams, there is a certain randomness to the way the ball bounces off the foot or off the post or whatever, and that means that any match is really potentially up for grabs in a way that kind of makes the each match incredibly exciting. I mean, you don't know for sure what's going to happen. So that's been fun to just to observe the sport of it as it unfolds.
Yeah, well, I heard one commenter, I wish I could remember who it was to give credit, but she said she always has four teams. There's one team that's her home team, one team that is a potential likely winner team, really good team. One team that could be a dark horse team, sort of an underdog that you get to root for, and then one team that you just never could root for. And I think I think that's kind of a fun way to think about it. And it if we're when we segue into elections, if you think about elections that way, then you're pretty clear that you're not trying to marry someone. You're thinking, who's a likely winner? Who could I never support? Who's an underdog that maybe I do want to support? You can make the same kind of analyses, but I don't want to switch the fun soccer talk away from that.
Well, I do think, Terry, that is a perfect segue into the lessons that we can learn from how FIFA structures this immensely popular tournament, where it is fun, but it's also something in which national pride is deeply, deeply connected to for countries around the world. And so there's a tremendous amount of pressure on FIFA to get this right, as I said at the top, to make sure the system's viewed as fair in how it determines who gets to advance. So maybe this is the right time to just ask all of you what parts of the tiebreaker system strike you as particularly interesting and potentially particularly instructive for election law scholars, election law or election administrators, and potentially even those people who draft our election laws. What can we learn from how FIFA structures this tournament?
Tony, before we jump into that, do you want to give just a brief? I mean, I know there's some complexity to the rules, but would it help just to lay the groundwork of exactly how the tiebreaker is currently structured?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think I made reference to this, but I think it's important for everyone to know that there are 48 teams in the tournament for the first round. So there are 48 teams who compete in 12 groups of 4 teams each. So that's 48 different competitors in the first round, but it goes down to 32 for the second round. And so the challenge for FIFA is how do you go from 48 to 32? The 48 teams in the first round compete in a round robin within their group. So they play each of the other 3 teams in their group, and they get 3 points for every team that wins their match in the first round are awarded 3 points. Teams that draw, they're tied with their opponent at the end of the match. Both teams get 1 point. And then, of course, if you lose, you get 0 points. So it's possible to get as many as 9 points after the group stage, the first round. It's also possible to get 0 points or some number of points in between 0 and 9. And it's when teams finish tied in points that FIFA's got a challenge, because the way the system's structured, the 48 teams are ranked within their groups. So if you are in the top 2 in your group, you advance. But if you're in third place in your group, you do have a chance to advance, but only if you finish in the top 8 teams of the 12 third place teams. So in other words, the top 2 finishers in the group are going to advance. You get 24 teams out of that. But you got to round out the round of 32 with 8 additional teams. And it's figuring out who those 8 additional teams are that creates so much of the controversy. The other issue is teams often finish tied for second. So you not only have teams tied for teams with the same number of points in third place, you also have teams tied for second. So how do you determine who's the actual second place team? So that's the structure of how FIFA has designed the tournament. And then the issue is, how do you actually break those ties?
And I'd add one more dimension, I think, which is you could also have in a given group of 4 teams a tie for first place.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to figure out who will be deemed then the first place winner in that group, which will affect their bracketing in the knockout stage.
That's exactly right, Steve. It's an important point because the bracketing ultimately decides who your second round opponent's against, how strong your second round opponent is, which is why there's been so much excitement, I think, in the U.S. over the tremendous performance of the U.S. team, because the U.S. team's guaranteed to have a more, this might be, I'm sure a competitor won't think of themselves this way, but they'll be viewed as more beatable team in the second round versus in the second round having to face off against Brazil or the defending champion Argentina or France, one of the traditional superpowers in soccer. So that, as Steve said, it's not just about advancing to the second round, it's about what your seed is.
So one of the things that I think is particularly interesting about the way FIFA has chosen the tiebreaker, and if I'm not mistaken, the exact details of the tiebreaker this time are new compared to previous World Cups, is they're prioritizing, if 2 teams are tied, either the kind of tie that Steve is talking about for first place or that Tony is talking about for second place, but if any 2 teams are tied, the initial tiebreaker is how those 2 teams did against each other. So if the 2 teams are tied in number of points within their group, but one of those 2 teams beat the other, the winning team is going to be advantaged, break the tie in that team's favor. And that's different from looking at the totality of performances within all of the group's competition so far. That would be the other philosophically different way of doing it. I mean, when group stage is over, each team will have had 3 performances. And you could make the tiebreaker determine on an evaluation of total performance against the group as opposed to just your performance against the one team that you're tied against. So I do
Now,
think it's interesting that they've chosen the direct comparison. I don't know how others feel about that.
well, I push back a little bit because I suppose the total performance that you mentioned, Ned, is already baked into the points that they've earned. I mean, in some sense, after they've each played the other three teams in their group, they've each had three matches and they each have now a total number of points. And that is, in some sense, their measure of total performance. And it's when that measure of total performance in the group stage produces a tie that then we have to have a tiebreaker. Now, that tiebreaker could involve some second level assessment of total performance. For instance, by looking at across all three of the matches, how many total goals did you score, for instance, right? And that's a second level total performance. But we already have a first level total performance. That's what's produced a tie in points. And the decision at that point to look at just the head-to-head results, I think is quite defensible when the first level measure of total performance has produced a tie. You've got two teams that are tied. Okay, well, how did they fare when they played each other? That's a sensible tiebreaker.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful clarification that you're absolutely correct that the tie, if we have a tie, the tie is produced by evaluation of total performance. And you're right, I wasn't meaning to criticize it. I was just pointing out, as you also did, that they could have made the tiebreaker another total performance metric as opposed to a head-to-head metric. And it is, in fact, the rules are complicated enough that if they can't break the tie based on head-to-head metrics, they revert back to, as you say, alternative total performance metrics, as I understand it. Is if I think it's total goal differentials become, and then goals scored in total, but that's only if the set of head-to-head tiebreakers aren't sufficient to break the tie. It's quite complicated, but in a fun way.
Not that complicated because we just described it in 4 minutes. I mean, I don't, some people describe any of these kinds of ways of solving who's the winner as too complicated, and they're unfamiliar, not necessarily too complicated.
Yeah, good. And in fact, I love that point because I don't think it is too complicated. And I think one of the hopeful lessons that we can draw from discussing the World Cup system is that if sports fans can understand how the World Cup works, voters can understand how elections could work if elections were worked in an equivalent way. So yes, but I think it's also fair to say that it is a little bit of a mouthful, right? I mean, we haven't quite completely discussed all the rules because, as I understand it, within the head-to-head tiebreakers, there's a ordering of three different ones. It's head-to-head points, then it's head-to-head goals. No, excuse me. Then it's head-to-head goal differentials. Then it's head-to-head affirmative goals. So there's sort of three head-to-head tiebreakers before you get to other non-head-to-head tiebreakers.
But in no case is there a do-over.
And Terry, I think that's one of the really interesting things that the tournament can't permit a do-over because they've got dates scheduled to be in stadiums. So this is an example of how an administrator's got to figure out a way to resolve a tie, even in the most unlikely circumstances where it seems like almost everything is lined up to make these two contenders mirror images of each other and equally deserving. You've got to find some way to distinguish between the otherwise equally deserving teams.
So I want to go ahead and make an observation about the potential analogy here to a certain kind of voting. I mean, we have talked previously in our podcasts about a kind of round robin voting. And of course, the group play in the World Cup is round robin. So you've got the four teams in your group, and you each play the other team once, and then you see how you perform compared to the other teams. And in this case, the top two teams automatically advance. And then, as we've talked about, some of the third place teams will advance as well. We've talked about using a round robin approach to a multiple candidate election in which what we are seeking to do is simply determine one winner from a round robin system of elections. And we've also talked about the relative simplicity of doing that if we only had three teams, if you will, three candidates in the pool, unlike the World Cup, which has four. And with four teams in the pool, it's a much more complicated process, especially when you're not just trying to pick the one most successful team in the pool, but two and maybe a third place team from the pool to advance. So, I mean, there are a number of ways in which round robin elections, as we've talked about them, are actually quite a bit simpler than what's going on at the World Cup. Mm-hmm. And I'll mention one more quickly. I mean, the first reason is that we've talked about using it to pick a winner from among three competing candidates, not four. Another reason is that the World Cup involves a game, football, or soccer to us in the US, in which it is common for teams to tie after regulation. And because ties are so common, the World Cup system awards 1 point to both teams if they've tied after regulation play during the round robin portion of the tournament, during the group play. Once we get past group play, when it's knockout, we can't have a game end in a tie. So we go to extra time and then we go to a shootout and so forth. Well, the possibility of an actual tie in the election context is much more remote than it is in the World Cup. And because the possibility of a tie is so unlikely in elections, we also, I think, can contemplate round robin elections in a different way. Now, there's one more dimension, and then I need to let the rest of you chew on this or tell me what you think. If we have three teams in a pool, and I've seen this in volleyball as well as in other soccer tournaments, if you have three teams in a pool playing round robin style, you can have team A beat team B, and team B beat team C, and team C beat team A. And then you do have a tie in the pool, even though you didn't have a tie in any one match. And you've got to figure out how to break that tie. That's still quite possible. But for those reasons, I think the possibility of analogizing the group play in the World Cup to, or round robin play in any other context to elections is actually dramatically easier than the World Cup tie-breaking system.
Yeah, that's also a super nice point that builds on Terri's earlier point. You know, people, when we talk about using a round robin format in elections, we do get pushback. Oh, this is way too complicated. People can't understand that. Well, A, it's not too complicated, and it's much less complicated, as Steve's saying, than using round robins in sports. And so it seems to me that it's quite and to stick with the three candidate example, because here in Ohio, there's actually a bill pending in the Ohio legislature that would essentially, if adopted, make elections into three candidate round robin tournaments in the final round. There'd be a primary, but three candidates would be on the ballot in November, and voters would vote the head-to-head matches between the three candidates, as Steve said, A versus B, A versus C, and B versus C. And hopefully there wouldn't be the kind of tie that Steve's talking about. If one of those three candidates beat each opponent head to head, that would be like ending up at the clear top of your group play, right? I mean, you win all of your group play matches, and if to use the World Cup analogy. But Steve's right, there could be a three-way tie um, among the three candidates who each beat one opponent head to head, but lost to one opponent head to head. And in that context, it's trickier to apply the World Cup tiebreaker because you've got a three-way tie, not just two candidates looking at just their head-to-head. You've got a triangular tie. So you really would have to look at some metric of overall group performance. And to analogize to soccer, instead of goal differential, it could be vote differential, or instead of total number of positive goals against both opponents, it could be just total number of positive votes against both opponents. And there's some other metrics as well. If there was a if we really want to think about the analogy, and again, I should be quiet and let people react, it's not inconceivable to have a four candidate round robin election, like four candidate World Cup round robin. It just requires 6 head-to-head matches instead of 3 head-to-head matches. And there are different ways you could actually have voters vote that on a ballot. We don't need to get into those technicalities, but you could have voters, vote all 6 head-to-heads. Do you like A versus B, B versus C, C versus D, et cetera, et cetera. If we all think that watching World Cup matches are fun, maybe voters would think filling out all the head-to-heads would be fun. So, and in that context, you could, if there was a tie between just two out of the 4 candidates in terms of number of head-to-head wins, that would be kind of like, a tie in World Cup. Then you could break that just by how those two teams did against or those two candidates did against each other.
And Ned, I think that point ties in with what Terri said right at the beginning about how when you're a viewer of the World Cup, one of the things that really makes it interesting is when you identify 4 teams, you sort of rank the ones, who's your favorite, whether you kind of like, and who's the one you really don't like. I think that it is analogous in a political environment, in an election, where most voters have a similar kind of approach where there'll be one candidate they really support. There'll be 2 other candidates who are acceptable, and then there'll be a candidate who's unacceptable. And so the viewership strategy itself has an applicability, I think, here to when it comes to lessons for designing election laws.
100%. And I just happened to be reading a law review article earlier today that got into this issue because the truth about a round robin format is it allows that opposition to, like, I really don't want this team to win the World Cup, or I really don't want this candidate to win. That gets equal importance in the overall design of the system in a round robin format. Because if you want one candidate to lose all of their head-to-heads, you can express that, and that expression will count just as much as I really want this one candidate to win all of their head-to-heads. Whereas some other voting systems don't allow for that full expression of preferences.
I mean, it seems to me the key thing here in terms of this analogy is that in group play, each team plays each other team in a head-to-head match. And in a round robin election, each candidate competes against each other candidate in a head-to-head contest. And if you have 3 candidates in the group, that's just 3 head-to-head choices the voters make. As you said, Ned, if you had 4 candidates in the group, as there are 4 teams in each group of the World Cup, you have 6 head-to-head contests, just like there are 6 matches in each of the World Cup groups right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely true. I'd be curious as to what everybody thinks about this idea that I want to throw out, which is as important as this analogy is, and as fun as it is to think about, um, there might be reasons to think that the most appropriate tiebreaker in a sport like soccer might be different than the most appropriate tiebreaker in a tournament of candidates in an election. Um, and I think you could argue this point either way because, um, I mean, I guess the goal of figuring out who should advance, like let's say only one team in soccer could advance out of the group stage. Presumably you want the the determination to be, who is the best team, who's the most deserving team out of the four teams to move out onto the knockout round. And it does make sense to say, figure out how many wins, head-to-head wins and how many draws they have. And if there's one clear winner, then you don't need a tiebreaker. That seems to make sense. And then and then if you have two teams that are tied, as Steve, you were saying, it makes sense. Which of those two teams bested the other of those two teams kind of makes sense. So you're kind of searching for the best team. Now you might say that you're doing the exact same thing in an election. We're trying to search for the best candidate in a pool of four candidates. And certainly if one candidate beat each of the other three candidates head to head, you might say, my goodness, well, that's clearly your best candidate. But do we think let's just imagine a four candidate election tournament and two candidates tied with the number of head to head wins. Each one had two head to head wins and one head to head defeat, let's say. But do we think that the best way of determining which candidate should be declared the winner of the election is whichever of those two beat each other, or again, some sense of how they performed overall in the electorate's mind, given the totality of the competition? In other words, would something like most votes overall or best vote differential overall be a better tiebreaker than just the head-to-head tie between the two candidates? I don't know if we have any intuitions on that.
Well, I think it's pretty easy to imagine the public expecting that if you had a series of head-to-head elections between four candidates that produced a tie for first place, where two of the four candidates had each won two of the head-to-head contests and lost their third, that as between those two, whichever one had beaten the other in that head-to-head race should be the winner. And I think, in fact, to try to use some alternative way of picking the strongest candidate would not fly with the public. I think the public would expect that the head-to-head results would be determinative. And there would be, I think, a determinative head-to-head result if you had four candidates who each tied with two wins and one loss. One of those would have lost the race to the other one.
Correct. Yeah.
And that would be easy. That would be really easy. Then to determine. It's not a complex system. Now, if we're back in a three candidate race where you have this kind of cycling where A beats B and B beats C and C beats A, then you don't have the situation with just two people tied and one of them beat the other head to head. So you need something else. That creates, I think, a little bit of a harder question, but I don't think it's that hard. And I think you decide in advance what you're going to do. And then the determination's easy once you've settled on what your tiebreaker is, whether it's the candidate who's losing contests had the smallest number, or the candidate who lost by the least number or something, which those are my thoughts about how you break a tie between the top two, whether it's in a 3-candidate race or a 4-candidate race of an election round robin.
Well, I think it's important to define best candidate. And I think we're assuming on some level that best candidate is person who has the most support, right? That would be looking at total number of votes. But we could also say the best candidate is the person who has the strongest support. And that might be, we might determine that in a different way. I hated those logic things for the LSAT, so I'm not one who can quickly figure out, well, if there were always going to be two, that one of those would always have more support. I can't figure all that out very quickly, but I think it's important to say what we mean by best candidate.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I guess I would start with the proposition, that elections should be decided based on majority rule or majority vote. So, if you only had two candidates in a race, whoever gets the most votes or more votes should win. And so that's why, if there are four candidates in the race, if and you construct this kind of round robin, if one candidate beats each opponent head to head, that means a majority of voters preferred that one candidate over each opponent. And that's like your most majority preferred candidate. Because if anybody else wins, that person raises their hand and says, wait a second, I could beat whoever you picked as a winner. More people prefer me to that putative winner. So that's why it's kind of easy if one candidate wins that way. Once you don't have that, once you have, any other result, that means that some even a candidate in a four candidate election, even if a candidate has won two head-to-head matches and lost one, that means that a majority of voters preferred somebody else to that candidate, right? I mean, they beat two opponents on a majority vote, but they lost to one opponent on a majority vote. And so now who should if we're voting for governor or voting for president, who gets to win? Now maybe the soccer analogy works, and is if there's a candidate who clearly has the most number of head-to-head wins, even if they don't win all, even if they aren't undefeated head-to-head, because in soccer we don't ask you to be undefeated, we just ask you to have more victories, or more victories plus more draws that add up to more points. But if you have a candidate who can't beat everybody else one-on-one, in some sense you have an unresolved election, right? Because somebody else could say, wait a second, whoever you put into office, there's somebody other candidate can say, well, a majority prefer me to whoever's winning. That's the problem with the kind of three-way tie that Steve was referring to. It's in the technical language, it's called a cycle, because if candidate A beats B and B beats C and C beats A, each one has one victory and one defeat. Who do you want to put in office? Now the argument, again, I'm going to be quiet in a second, but the argument in favor of the tiebreaker rule that Steve just mentioned, which doesn't come up in soccer, I don't think, which is narrowest defeat. The argument for that in the election context is if you've got a tie, then whichever candidate comes closest to breaking that tie is closest to being that true majority winner that you're after. Another way of saying it is they have the least opposition. If you put into office the candidate whose defeat was the narrowest defeat, you've got the fewest voters upset with the result. And if you can only put one person in office, there's going to be one person as governor, or one person as president, or one person as senator, and you've got some kind of tie, maybe the best way to break the tie is making the fewest voters upset as to what the outcome is.
Ned, on that very point, I think in a way that we're talking about soccer, but in a way, I think college football also provides a powerful analogy to that exact point you're making. Of course, this is a podcast of the Ohio State University, where football is taken, rightfully so, very seriously. For years, there wasn't a college football playoff. And so there was always controversy. Some team would go 11 and 0, maybe a Big Ten team would go 11 and 0 in 1979, and an SEC team would go 9 and 2. But then the SEC would complain and say, wait a second, that 11-0 Big Ten team shouldn't be declared the national champion because we're playing in a tougher conference. So you would have this constant controversy and then a demand that these teams play each other head to head in a postseason tournament so that there's more legitimacy in the awarding of the national championship. And then you have today with the college football playoff, a tremendous amount of focus on who makes it into the college football playoff. And one of the criteria that looms very large with teams that have losses is what was their margin of defeat? To your point, Ned, about the margin of victory in the head-to-head. A team that loses in a blowout, it has just one loss, but's lost badly in the blowout, often ends up being jumped by teams with two losses, but two close losses, because that's considered a better resume. So I think college football, in its own way, also provides support for the point you were just making.
I had not put that connection together. That's really, really helpful. So do you have a view then, Tony, on why that metric is not used in the World Cup?
Yeah, I don't know why, other than I think it goes to the point, and Steve had made it right at the beginning, that the scores are so low in soccer. It's harder. A team might win 1-0 and totally dominate the match. They get an early goal and then kind of play defense the rest of the way. Whereas in college football, there's so much more scoring. It gives you a better sense. The margin tells you a lot more about the difference between the two teams than soccer does. That's what I would guess is why they don't put as much weight on it.
Yeah, nice.
So can I make 3 quick points?
Yes, absolutely.
One is that in the round robin election context, I just want to reiterate that the need for a tiebreaker is not going to arise that often. I mean, we need to have a tiebreaker available if we're using a round robin election, but not because it's going to be deployed very often. In the World Cup, the tiebreakers are really critical because they're showing up all the time. We're having ties that have to be resolved, and that just wouldn't be that likely in elections. Now, the second point I want to make comes back to the majoritarian ideal here, and that is what we think of as the best candidate, the candidate that receives a majority of support. And if you would just have 2 candidates in an election, by definition, the candidate with the most votes is that person. The problem is, do we just want to limit the voters to 2 candidates in the general election? And we have, in most places, not done that. We've let third-party candidates run, and then we have often had plurality winners who don't have a majority support. We could limit candidates, or limit the pool to just 2 candidates in the general election, and then we would absolutely have a majority of support. But there are independent reasons, and maybe this is analogous too to the World Cup, saying we're going to have 48 teams in this World Cup, reasons to think voters should be given more than 2 choices in the general election. But if we want them to have more than 2 choices and we want a majoritarian outcome, then we've got to figure out how to do that. And taking head-to-head results is a really good way to do that. And the third thing I just want to say is everything we've been talking about is different from ranked choice voting as it's currently used most widely. And I think it bears noting that. I mean, this is a complexity we could talk a lot about. You can use ranked choice ballots to do head-to-head results, but you don't need to. And the way ranked choice voting is used in the places that it's used now is not in the way we've just talked about, a round robin kind of head-to-head evaluation of the true majoritarian winner.
I do think it's important to mention timing because that comes up so much when you talk about changing electoral systems. Like, well, we have primaries, and that's a day, an election little season for the primaries, and then we have the general. And the World Cup is going on for 6 weeks to sort through all these layers and levels. But we can do with the magic of computers, we can do what we're talking about with one ballot, right? Yeah. So if somebody could say how you would structure a ballot so that I can walk into the polling place and do all my head-to-heads, let's say of 4 candidates, and know an outcome within a reasonable amount of time. I'm not one who says you need to know by the end of election day. I am not a fan of that. But reasonable, how would you structure the ballot so that I could vote my 3 head-to-heads with the 4 candidates all on one ballot?
Well, with 4 candidates, if you wanted a head-to-head ballot, you'd have to have 6 head-to-heads, just because when you figure out A versus B, A versus C, A versus D, but there ends up being 6 matches. And to ask voters to do 6 votes per office would be, I think, a lot to expect. Now, if it's a really important office like president, you might structure it so that we want 4 finalists in the November ballot so people can vote 6 head-to-heads. That might not be too much to ask of voters. But as Steve said, you can construct the head-to-head competition from a ranked choice ballot. So if voters voted, let's say there are 4 candidates, and voters said first choice, second, third choice, fourth choice, in the way that you were talking about your ideal viewership of soccer, who you like best, who you hate the most. If you did that in order in 4, the computer can construct the 6 head-to-heads off of those rankings, because for every pair of candidates, one's going to be ranked higher, one's going to be ranked lower. So yeah, there's a way to do this so that voters only have to show up at the polls once, other than the primary, if this is the general election with 4 candidates or 5 candidates, voters only have to show up once, fill out the ballot, and the computer, whether it's that night or the next day or whatever, the computer will just process the tournament. Unlike a soccer tournament where you really need separate matches on separate days, the electoral tournament all happens inside the computer after the ballots have been cast.
And if it's a 3 candidate election rather than 4, if it's structured that way, then it's simpler. And you can construct a ballot that just says for the voters, as between A and B, who would you vote for? As between B and C, for whom would you vote? And as between C and A, for whom would you vote? And you just give them that. They don't have to rank it. They just make their choice with respect to the 3 different head-to-head choices.
Yeah, and when it's 3 candidates, it's almost simpler to do head-to-head than to do a ranking.
Yeah.
And it's certainly simpler for viewers, voters in their viewing capacity on election night, looking at the screen saying who won. The head-to-head results just come in directly, and has one candidate won both their head-to-heads, in which case they're clearly going to be the winner because only one candidate can win 2 head-to-heads in a 3 candidate round robin. But if there's this rare, as Steve said, rare 3-way tie, so that each has one victory and one defeat, as Steve said, as long as you know in advance what your tiebreaker rule is, narrowest defeat, most total votes, whatever it is, it's very straightforward how that tiebreaker is going to work. You can see it immediately.
I think FIFA is an example of that, Ned, in that they post on the internet what the tiebreaker rules are in advance. And I'm sure they're posting on the internet in every language around the world, and rightfully so, because it's so important to get those groundwork rules established and to anticipate potential issues.
In fact, what I was seeing last night, I sort of caught it for the first time, that's directly analogous to elections, is that they were showing points in each group in real time. So if the current match was tied, they were treating that in terms of calculating final points. That's like on election night when 50% of the votes are in, like that's the equivalent of halftime in the soccer game, what the standings are. So yeah, they were doing that because fans want to know in real time, how does my team stand compared to the competition? So yeah,
I noticed that too. It caught me by surprise at first to realize that at least some of the time, the points they were displaying were not locked in yet. They were still subject to change if the match underway ended up in a different outcome.
I was totally scratching my head because they were showing two teams having 5 points. And I'm like, wait a second, this is the third game or third match, right? And I knew each team that was treated as having 5 points had one victory and one draw. And I'm saying I can do the math.
That's 4 points.
But the two teams were tied against each other in the match actually at play. So they were treating it as if that the current match was as of that moment, it was a draw. So I thought that was really interesting.
And I think it shows that the rules might seem complex, but if voters, or in this case, fans are invested, they will become knowledgeable. They'll understand it as long as there's a logic behind it. They will. So this shouldn't be, in my view, an impediment to an election law change that is analogous to sports, because it's also going to mean you're going to be using an accepted method in an area that's extremely important to most people, which is sports, and an area where fairness, again, is just essential to the legitimacy of the outcome.
100%.
And
Unfortunately,
in
yes, Terri.
in the electoral context, it's kind of nice to think about how many fewer variables there are, because nobody's got a referee during the voting. I mean, there's people making sure that the process is happening, but there are not calls being made that, you got to go to the VAR and that kind of thing. And additionally, nobody's calf gets injured, and makes it like, wow, are they going to show up or not? So it's actually, the election process has some simplicity to it, comparatively speaking, in terms of how we get points.
Absolutely. We've got the results. We just need to analyze what those results mean. Yeah. Well, we're out of time for today's broadcast, but I just want to thank my friends Terri and Ned and Steve for another fun and fascinating discussion of how the World Cup has lessons for election law. Please don't forget to press like and subscribe on YouTube or Apple Podcasts, and be on the lookout for our next episode of Law and Democracy.